This is accessible game design, video game design, better games for everyone. We're mostly going to be talking about what developers can do to make games more accessible for people with disabilities and for everyone. So let me introduce my co-panelist.
Hi, my name is Daniel Greenberg. I'm an adjunct professor at George Mason University, where I teach in the computer game design program. My specializations are in transmediation of games and other forms of art, particularly later Italian opera. I've also worked in human factors engineering in Section 508 compliance for various federal government programs. And I'm also the founder of Winter Ion Game Studios, which just recently located from Virginia to Maryland.
And I am Ruthie Edwards. I am currently studying experience design at VCU, but I'm an avid indie game developer, and I love doing game jams, which is kind of like a hackathon where you have 48 hours to make games. I've done that like 25 times. It's a great way to get started in game dev, highly recommend it. But I'm a game lover at heart. I've always loved games, and I kind of wanted to share what games mean to me. So at school, I kind of realized not everyone likes games, and that kind of shocked me. I'm in this bubble where everyone loves games. All we want to do is talk about games and go up to our hotel room and play Smash Brothers at night and just stay up and play games nonstop, but I have a lot of colleagues that don't understand that, so they call me the video game lady. Because whether they like it or not, I'm going to talk about video games. And it's such an important part of my life that I realize a lot of other people don't have. Because not only is it an important way to relax and be entertained, it has this awesome community behind it too. Communities that are in a virtual space that you can't have those type of interactions in the real world, but also interactions in real life, like at MAGFest or at game jams, like Global Game Jam. So this is our Richmond crew here. And second, or I guess third, games are super creative. I love how they stretch your imagination, they force you to figure out logic puzzles, and if you're involved in game development, it's like incredibly creative to find solutions to problems. But this is not a presentation about me. This is a presentation about TJ. So I met TJ on a Reddit post about Diablo 3. He's a pretty typical gamer guy. He's like, lives at home, he's from the Midwest, he loves Call of Duty and Diablo 3. He's kind of an aspiring streamer. You can see he has like a couple thousand subscribers. But anyway, I ran into him talking about Diablo 3 on Reddit. So Diablo 3 is a game by Blizzard, came out in 2012, and it's had some mods come out for it. Hopefully you can hear some audio. So it's a pretty classic, like hack and slash dungeon crawling game. And TJ likes to stream that on YouTube and Twitch. But when he streams it, this is what he sees. TJ is completely blind. When he plays the game, he generally turns his TV off because he doesn't need to see it at all. And it's because of these intentional choices the designers at Blizzard made that he's able to play that game. So I started talking with him on Reddit to try and understand how he can play these games and actually be good at them. And it turned out to be really, really interesting. He says, I don't see anything at all, so I don't even have my TV turned on most of the time. The sound gives a general direction if you're far away from the enemy, and the closer you get, the more distinct the sound becomes, resulting in being able to identify when they are behind a wall or out of your character's sight. I can identify when I go behind a wall and an enemy is within a clear line of sight enough to not shoot through a wall. This also translates to footsteps and gunshots. I have enough experience and practice to even put that skill into long-range combat. I can identify when an enemy is able to be shot, even at extreme distance. Most of the time I get 1 or 2 hit markers on an enemy, but don't end up killing them. But up close, they usually die. So he's using all of this sound cues and this 3-dimensional sound that he's hearing on his headphones to identify where enemies are in the battlefield. So here's a clip. He's actually playing in this GIF. So he's facing a old subway car or something like that, and he hears an enemy in the distance, and he's able to turn his controller to face that enemy and pretty accurately guess where the enemy is, even though he can't see it. So it's these intentional choices that the developers have made in this game that let TJ understand how to figure out where the enemy is, how far away, what kind of terrain they're standing on, because the footsteps make different sounds, whether they're walking on stone or whether they're walking in grass. He can also tell whether the sound is muffled, so if the enemy is behind a wall, he can tell if the sound is muffled that they're behind a wall and he can't shoot them. And he's like reasonably accurate. I really appreciate how many, I think he has like 10,000 kills, which is really insane for any player. So just to back out a little bit from TJ to the industry, most of the video game industry is not regulated. We have the ESRB who does ratings, but that's really it, except for a new FCC rule that went into effect in January, but that only affects in-game communication like text or mic chat. So more often than not, accessibility falls into the hands of designers and developers. I hope in the future that you'll see more middleware coming out, so you'll see text-to-speech APIs and other accessibility tools for game developers to use to make their games more accessible, because it can be a burden to put in things like text-to-speech, but hopefully that space grows so that everybody can enjoy games. Just to talk about some definitions of these words, if you're not familiar with accessibility, accessibility is the design of a service, a product, a building, anything that enables people with disabilities to access it. Usability is a little bit different, but it includes some of the same principles. So it's design that creates more efficiency and more enjoyability for everyone. So I use those two together a lot, even though they're different terms. Accessibility benefits everyone, and the classic example is, let's say you have a door, and that might not be accessible to someone with a physical disability. So you have this button that automatically opens the door, and all of a sudden, now everyone's able to access it, from a person who's in a wheelchair to a person who's using a cane or crutches, maybe has a temporary disability like a broken leg. People who are caring for a child, that's not a disability, but you could consider it like a temporary limitation. Or someone who's carrying a big suitcase. So accessibility makes things better for everybody. Usability can improve that. So you have this door with the push button, but I think a better design would just be one of those automatic doors where the doors open and close, right? So everybody can benefit from that, and it's an improved design over the first one, because you don't even need to push a button, you can just go straight through the door. So what I've done in my master's program is made a set of guidelines for game developers. It's at accessiblegamedesign.com if you want to look at it at home. I know the internet's not so good here, but I want to go over a couple of examples from it. It is pretty dense. It has a lot of suggestions on what to do about like health bars and controls and all of these different components that make up a game. And so I know there's a lot of guidelines out there for accessibility already, but a lot of them focus on what not to do, like don't include QuickTime events. And I wanted to make a space where you could find things to do, not only things not to do. So people can come there to find accessible ideas, usable ideas, and clever game design ideas. This is just what the game design guidelines look like. They're live on the web right now, if you want to look at them. It includes everything from like, whoa, I think my browser needs to be bigger. Hold on. Anyway, so the guidelines include everything from like the HUD to all these status effects and buffs and how to show poison without relying on color, because colorblind people can't see it and stuff like that. A whole section on controls, because everyone should be able to, it's like huge, everyone should be able to remap controls. And you should include alternate control schemes. You shouldn't use WASD only because that's not accessible by people, say, on a French keyboard. And as far as I know, being French isn't a disability. And then some critique about games that require motion controls. So yeah, that's not showing up right, but you can look at it later. So here's some other examples from those guidelines. So one classic game component is a health bar. When a lot of designers first start putting a health bar in their game, they'll put it in like this, where it's a fraction. So you have 100 health points, and you have 75 of those left. Not incredibly accessible, not very usable. Also hard to read at a glance. So what you can do is make it more usable by including a bar. Pretty simple concept, but the reason you might do that is because there's 4 different ways health can go. It can go up rapidly, like if you're using a potion. It can go down rapidly if you're getting hurt. It can also go up steadily if you're doing healing over time, and it can also go down over time, like if you're poisoned or taking damage over time. So it's important not only to show the number, but also the acceleration of that number. And it's hard to show acceleration with just a number like this, but you can see the acceleration of a bar or a dial or something visual really, really easily. So that's a usability thing. It's also an accessibility thing I found out because I was interviewing a gamer who had a low field of view. So some people will call it tunnel vision, but basically he had no peripheral vision. So for him, it was really hard to look at his character, then look all the way up at the interface, and then look back to the character to just check his health bar. So one way that we could get around that is including health bars diegetically. So diegetics is a movie term. Usually it means within the scene. So if a sound is within the scene, or say a piece of music, to be diegetic, it would have to be sung by the actor or played through a radio. If it's non-diegetic, it's something like in Top Gun when you hear "Highway to the..." Like, unless Kenny Loggins is flying around on a cloud in that scene, it's non-diegetic. So that's the clarification there. So things like interface elements where you have health bars, you have statistics at the top of the screen that are not in the environment, that's non-diegetic. So for him, it really helped if the characters in the game showed the health on the character in some way. So one example that I hope you guys are all familiar with. When I showed this at grad school, I was not sure. But so this is an example of how you could show a health bar diegetically. Oh, I'm sorry, that sounds honestly. Okay. Does anyone see a health bar on this interface? No. Where's the health bar?
The size of the character.
The sound and the size of the character. So in a lot of ways, this game is very accessible because you have sound that tells you when you've hit an enemy or when you're hitting a wall, but you also have the visual of Mario shrinking. So when Mario is big, he has 2 lives, let's say. When he's small, he has 1 life. And that's a really creative way to handle health. You basically don't need to see any of the stuff at the top of the screen. Here's another example of a way to do, I guess we have to watch that. Here's another example of how to incorporate health diegetically. This is Balloon Fight. I love how intuitive the health is incorporated into this game. It is shown by the 2 balloons that are on the fighter. You have 2 when you start the game. If someone pops your balloon, like this, pop, you hear that pop sound. You also see the balloon disappear. And it's also really obvious that if you lose your balloons, you're going to fall into the water at the bottom. So it's accessible, but it's also incredibly usable because this game would have been played in an arcade where people don't have time to read instructions, maybe they don't have sound because it's very loud in a bar or an arcade. So it's really cleverly designed where someone who has just put a quarter in and is seeing this game for the first time can understand, oh, the balloons are my health, and if I lose them, I die. So here's an example from a more modern game. There's no sound on this clip, it's just a GIF. But the health bar is actually on the player's pack, if you can see it when it comes into view. So you have this health bar on the player's pack on the back. And I think that is a really, really cool way to show health diegetically and also make the game more immersive. Another common element in games is a timer. The timer in Mario looks something like this. It says time, and then it has a number of seconds, I guess, but like, I don't even know how many minutes that is, 5, 6, who knows? It's really hard to read time in seconds when it's more than 60. Not very usable, also not very accessible because there's no sound to go along with it. So what you can do is represent time as a dial. That's incredibly useful because you can see the acceleration of time. You can also see how much you have left, how much you've expended, and it's much easier to read that than a second counter. Of course, you always want to have both visual and audio feedback when you have any type of game element that you need to convey to the player. One little game I saw this year that I really liked that did a timer well is Merrily Parallel. So it has this little hourglass at the top, which is a really easy way of understanding how much time you have left. But it also has music that goes along with it. And I don't know if you noticed, but the music speeds up when you get to the end. And it's actually composed in a way that the music ends as you die. So you hear that bum, 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 and then you die. So I really love that example because typically when people do timers in games, they do like a tick, tock, and that can be really, really grating. So I thought that was really clever. So there's obviously a lot more to learn. We're gonna do Q&A for the most part. So I wanted to let you guys have that, play around with it. Absolutely send me feedback or ask any questions about that. It's a living document. I've just worked on it for 1 semester, so I appreciate any feedback you guys have on that. But for now, let's take some questions from the audience. Right here?
Yeah, so I'm an FPS player, played Overwatch, I played a really competitive level. It's killing me that they took a character who had a gun that just like locked onto people, and once you did it once, as long as you were in range, you just like rubber banded and found them. Symmetra. And now they've made it like, you know, high skill, high reward. But it's like, as somebody who has a disability that sometimes I just can't aim, if I realize mid-game that, oh, I have to do damage, we have a tank-based comp, and I can't aim, I could just play this character, like, I can still dance around my body, and just have it be like, oh, yep, it's hitting somebody. And it's really great for people who aren't necessarily disabled, who might just be tired.
Yeah.
And then I realize, well, fuck, I can't aim, so I'll just, Symmetra. And it bothers me to all hell that like that option of needing to always be on your A game or it was taken away.
That's really interesting. I think it's important for developers to always include different modes of play. A lot of like hardcore gamers are afraid that if a game becomes accessible, it won't become challenging anymore, but that's absolutely not the case. You can always include different modes, different characters that play different ways. I think a really good example is the latest Tomb Raider game. There's different levels of difficulty for different modes. I think I have a photo of it on here actually.
Oh, right, with the puzzles versus like the actual combat difficulties?
Yeah, so you can adjust the difficulty of the combat, you can adjust the difficulty of the puzzles separately. So if you maybe aren't so good at aiming, but you do like challenging puzzles, you can have those on different difficulties, which is cool.
Yeah, and it's sort of a notion of conjunctive gameplay. Some genres do this better than others. MMORPGs have been adept at this for years, right? If you think about it, there's so many different ways you can play that genre. You might be somebody that does a lot of gathering or trade skill work. You might be someone that engages in PvP more, someone who goes and tackles scripted bosses and dungeons. The game's designed to be played a number of different ways, and so it's easier for that particular genre to have certain modes that are more or less effective at capturing gameplay for people who may or may not be fully, able to play one mode, can have another mode, and so forth. Something like a competitive first-person shooter, I think there's more growth needed necessarily in the space, and that comes down to understanding what verbs are available at your disposal as a designer, and honestly having more subject matter experts in the room.
Cool. Right here.
I was curious if either of you, or maybe anybody in the room, has had any experience with Microsoft's new adaptive Xbox controller. When I saw it, I thought it was really intriguing, and I was just curious if there was any kind of opinions or feedback on it. I think it's a neat piece of technology.
I think so we're talking about the Microsoft Xbox Adaptive Controller, which is this very cool gamepad. It has two big switches on it and also has, I think, 19 inputs that you can plug in different controllers. So if you have any sort of mobility disability, you can use different controllers for it. And I think it retails for like 80 or 90 bucks, so it's reasonably priced for something like that. Typically, the controllers you operate with your mouth or your feet can be really expensive for some reason. So I like that it's kind of widely available, and the packaging is made so that you're able to open it even if you have mobility issues. But when I talk to most people, they've never heard of it. So there's an awareness issue with it, but I do think it's really, really cool that they've done that.
And again, this is another example of, I think, where we talk about accessibility benefiting everyone. The adaptive controller is really, really great if you have specific needs because you can address them. Any individual button, trigger, the D-pad, whatever you're working with, you can map it to a specific device, a button, a switch, whatever you need to control that. But if you think about this from a designer perspective, this is the sort of improvement that long-term gives you the option to do all sorts of interesting things. From an art perspective, we can start to do interesting galleries where certain controls are mapped and triggered to things we may not even be thinking of, like Arduino-driven displays or things that are automatic or capture sound sensors, light sensors. It gives us the opportunity to expand games that didn't have reached to broader reaches because certain control schemes that weren't available are now available. So.
In the red here,
The game you showed the light bars on the body, what game was that?
that's Dead Space.
And Dead Space has the added benefit of not only does having Isaac's health on his back keep you sort of focused on the character, and those who are sort of narrowly perceiving that are getting all the information they need and they're not sort of looking tangentially to the sides of the screen to get it. It's a horror game. So if you think about it from an immersion standpoint, not only are those who can't process all this information coming at them from different directions getting the benefit of having everything they need to know directly on the character's back, those who don't have that concern are getting a more immersive experience, so the game is doing a better job of sinking you into gameplay, and thus when it tries to scare you, you're sort of less removed from the outside world where the disruptions of a bunch of stats and menus and screens might make the realism go away a little bit. You're less likely to be intimidated or scared because the veneer of a game is there. In Dead Space, if you're that immersed and you're that into it, the game's gonna be that much more effective at scaring you when it wants to.
All the way in the back. Yep.
Speaking again, going back to the Microsoft controller, what are your thoughts on the fact that so many of these accessible things, I'm a special education teacher, I work with a lot of low-income students, they would benefit greatly from a lot of this stuff, but it's so expensive to, what are your thoughts, and are there any workarounds with it?
It's hard to say right now. I think the Xbox One is pretty reasonably priced considering the regular controller is 60 or so, or 50. But you're right, for the most part, like the eye tracking devices and the foot pedals can be really expensive. There's some great people like Able Gamers that are doing cool things like fundraising to give people with disabilities these devices. But I don't know, do you have any ideas of how, do you have an idea of how we can make it?
So there's this
accessible?
thing called Makey Makey. I'm a huge fan. I had to Google it really quick to remember what it's called. It's literally just cardboard and foil and cables. The idea is to get programming and engineering into classrooms who might not have the kind of budget for these controllers. And there's a demo where, I want to say it was like a college class, used Makey Makey to make accessible games for a special needs classroom. So there's kids with mobility problems, kids with physical, like tactile problems, and spatial problems especially. So there were kids in wheelchairs who just had things on their handles, so they could run by hitting, or tapping things with their foot if they could. And it was just all cardboard and tinfoil.
That's awesome.
So it's really, really cool. So it's Makey Makey if you want to look it up.
Yeah, so that, the Makey Makey is this really interesting device where you can, it's kind of already rigged up to the arrow keys and the space bar, and you can just use alligator clips. There's no soldering required. You can make controllers out of anything. I think the classic example that's on the box is you can make a piano out of bananas. So I think a really cool idea would be to have other students in a school making controllers for people with disabilities, because you could make it being able to play with your hands or your arms or your feet or anything like that. That'd be a really cool idea and really, really budget friendly too. In the FBI hat.
Excellent. Two things. Are there any good middleware resources you can point us to? And are there any awards given out for like excellence in this field?
So I'm not too familiar with the awards. I know that there's a lot of opportunities, current issues down the river aside, there's normally grants and opportunities for work in this field, especially like the National Endowment for the Humanities and so forth. I'm not too familiar from a middleware perspective.
I know there's JAWS, which is a common screen reader. That's probably the most popular screen reader for people who are blind or have or low vision. And they have APIs that you can incorporate in games. Xbox has something in their dev kit for speech to text. But yeah, the industry needs a lot of work in that area, because that could take a lot of load off the developers, because it can be kind of a burden to incorporate text to speech or things like captions.
And if I can just add on real quick, you mentioned when you talk about the ESRB and how we don't really have a lot of regulation. The public space right now is very well regulated in this regard. Section 508 has an extremely clear set of guidelines, and there's really good expectations sort of in the public sector as what's expected from websites and media and what you produce that people interact with. And as those get more and more interactive, I think those guidelines are a very good starting point for a lot of private institutions. Games are no exception in this regard, to find a really good starting point for things that they probably have thought about and things they probably haven't thought about.
Cool, right in the front.
In your making your guidelines, where did you pull from? Like, what standards have you used otherwise? Elsewhere, because when I went to look, there's like a couple of different websites. There's no definitive site, and I just wonder what have you looked to as for other examples of guidelines that you
Cool. So the question is, what did I use as references and inspiration for the guidelines? There's a lot of great guidelines out there already. AccessibleGameDesignGuidelines.com, I think, is the most popular one. It's put together by a lot of industry experts like Ian Hamilton and Barry, I forgot his name, but it's a collaborative effort from a lot of people, especially in the IGDA has a special interest group for accessibility. So I pulled a lot of the stuff that I didn't know about, adapting controllers and whatnot. But a lot of the visual design is just based on my experience as a game developer. I've done a lot of game jams, and I've gotten a lot of feedback on all my crappy games that I've made. But I'm also an experienced designer, so I can understand how people are using a game. I did a lot of interviews with people with disabilities, everyone from people with low vision to people with multiple sclerosis, people with PTSD, and everything in between. So a lot of it was informed by those personal interviews too. In the back, yep.
Are there any efforts in the industry to adapt WCAG guidelines or to come up with their own sort of guidelines along those lines?
I think the accessible game design or accessible guide, oh shoot, I forgot what the website is. The main IGDA ones are the most like accepted. It's not exactly standardized or anything like that, but I think that one's pretty much the standard. Let's see. In the middle here with the zip up.
Hey, there's, as individual artists, something that you can do to raise awareness of accessible design, whether it's for gaming or anything else, is to just try to pay attention to it as you're working in your own things. So for one example is that if you work in Adobe software using Illustrator or Photoshop, there is a color proofing option that will allow you to simulate approximately what somebody with the two most common forms of color blindness would see if they're looking at your artwork, your design, your poster, your texture, or whatever it is you're making. There's also free online sites that will do that for you, so it's worth looking into those as a standard check that you do anytime you're designing something. Will this design work for somebody with color blindness? And thinking about the other potential issues as well.
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice. So if you're a designer, what can you do to increase awareness and make sure that you're in compliance as well? And one of the ideas was to use a color checker. I think using a contrast checker is useful also, or designing your game in black and white so you can make sure it's clear to everyone before you start adding color in. I think we all need to raise awareness of stuff like this, and Mark Brown, Game Maker's Toolkit, he has a great YouTube series on accessibility, and he has a great video about visual design and color blindness in games, where he points out a lot of the things that people are doing wrong. And so I wanted to kind of point out some of the things that people are doing right on the site, so I wrote a Medium article, and I sent that out to the world, and I think it caught a lot of new eyes that weren't thinking about it before. So I think we just need to keep talking about it, keep designing examples, keep finding games that have really cool examples of accessibility, and games that have different colorblind modes, or games where you can pick your own color palette, things like that, that we can put those out on Twitter and keep raising awareness that those things are necessary.
Yeah, and this is also an opportunity where you can sort of get multiple benefits out of something. If you're going to go through the work to either acquire or develop or polish some sort of checker in your system, it's very easy to turn that around and make that an option or a setting in your game, right? If you've done the legwork to be able to sort of scan and identify your game under certain conditions, make that available in the options menu for your players so that if they have or need, a certain condition or mode to be set, they can do so and then use the same tools that you had at your disposal for playing the game that you used as, in the process of developing it.
Right here in the Cape.
Hi, so I was very recently diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. It's a very big problem for me, and I'm a huge gamer, obviously, because I'm here at MAGFest. My fear is that, even if I were to get something like an accessible controller, because my pain is full body, that I would not find something that would work for me and allow me to play without pain. So do you have any experience with gamers with chronic pain, controllers that work, tools that work, things like that, that you can give me some advice on?
About controllers, I'm not sure that there are any physical controllers that might help you. Maybe an eye tracker, where you're using the motion of your eyes to control, say, a cursor or to click on things. And those, I think Tobii, T-O-B-I-I, makes some that are fairly affordable. A lot of hardcore gamers like to use those too, because aiming with your eyes is faster than aiming with a mouse. So I like that it kind of helps everybody. I think it's kind of up to the design of the game as well. A game that, say, has a timer or quick timed events is obviously going to be, it may be out of reach to someone, like the gamer that I interviewed who had multiple sclerosis. She couldn't play her favorite game anymore because you had to mash the A, the B, the Y, the R all at the same time, and she just couldn't do it. So I think the design of the games needs to improve to where, say in the latest Uncharted 4, you could get rid of those quick time events, or games where you have to mash a button really rapidly. That's no one likes doing that. So just don't do that. But A lot of games are coming out with accessibility modes. Uncharted 4 has a lot of those. So if you are maybe you have a cognitive disability or a physical disability, you can't aim very well, it has auto lock on. So I think, Uncharted 4 is a great example of a game that has a lot of different accessibility options that can adapt to different styles of play.
And this is where I think getting farther along in the hardware sphere is going to be a much bigger jump, I think, like in terms of making things available for people than necessarily software. One of the things we had is early on, a lot of our study into how people played games was dependent upon the hardware that we had at the time, and which was almost exclusively simple consoles and PC. So orthopedics, for a long time, had this term Nintendo thumb, because they had a lot of clinical cases of people with repetitive stress injuries, to their thumbs because they were playing a game with 2 buttons and the D-pad, and this was sort of an exclusive thing. So we have a lot of recorded and tracked understanding for some of the ergonomics for the early problems. As controllers have expanded, as kind of our control schemes have, and as things have gotten broader spectrum-wise, I think we're still kind of very early on in identifying like higher order ways of dealing with input and how to either mitigate or allow those who already have conditions to fully input with the devices that we've got at our disposal.
In the middle with the white.
Yes, there was a game that was recently released that it's kind of simple, like Flappy Bird, but you move your character with vocalization. So you jump, you collect coins, things like that. And I think that's a really great step in the right direction, especially with the arthritis.
That's cool. Do you know the name of it?
It's not Crossy Roads, but I think it's something similar. That you play as a chicken or a bird.
Okay.
Is that the one where you just scream at it?
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
Oh my god, it's so fun.
We're talking about a game that uses voice commands to control a character, which is a really cool, accessible thing. I haven't played a lot of games that use voice, except for there was like a Skyrim game on the Alexa. It was kind of like it was a choose your own adventure game, and it said, do you want to go to the creepy old windmill? And I said, no. And it's like, oh, well, do you want to go to the creepy farm? And I'm like, no. I just kept saying no, and eventually the game crashed.
It's actually a really interesting sphere. Like, think about how many homes are now being equipped with smart devices and the opportunity. That's like a whole sector for game developers to start pursuing. And that's exciting because that's an entire sphere of gaming that isn't relying on visual presentation.
Yeah.
So I think you're going to get a lot of interesting experiences that maybe because we've been kind of spoiled with making fancy modern 3D stuff for the last decade and change, that it's a chance to kind of pull back and do some other design ideas.
In the center, in the hat.
Hey, so what I've discovered lately in like more modern games is as the graphics get more refined and it gets more spinny and interactive, I start getting nauseous playing the game. And I'm not the only one who gets this. Like my able friends are complaining about this too. Do you have any suggestions for how I can enjoy these games without throwing up all over myself?
So the question is about games that have a lot of 3D movement or screen shake and things that can be really nauseating. I think every game should have the ability to turn screen shake off, because I hate that, and I to be clear, I don't have a disability and I hate it. It makes me just feel awful. It makes my eyes hurt, my head hurt. So the game developers need to put those types of things in as an option, just like in software. You go on your iPhone or your Mac, and you can reduce the amount of windows whipping around the screen and animating and stuff. It's why does that exist in the first place? I just want to turn it all off. But do you have any advice?
Yeah, so there's a couple things here, right? Like you said, if you're going to go through the effort as a developer to create ways to make the screen more frenetic, more energetic, you've already gone from base state to that. There's no reason not to put the toggle in to remove that. I want to shake my fist just slightly at modern TV creators. Software developers, just like filmmakers, have an idea of what they're trying to present to you, and it's a very crafted frame-by-frame experience. TV-generated interpolated frames being shoved in between real frames not only has the effect of making it look kind of weird and fluid and discomforting and adding some of that uncanny valley, but it also is something that isn't really authorial intent for the developers, and it's really to create unnatural movement that may be like hard to watch or just, you know, it's an added level things. Like, it's hard enough we're trying to make a game that isn't going to make you throw up. You making an extra game wedged in between our game that we can't account or deal for is another problem entirely.
Yeah. One game I thought had approached this really well. It was a fighting game like Mortal Kombat. I can't think of what it was. It had a lot of options that you could customize the battle arena, and you could completely knock out the background. So for someone who has trouble maybe picking their character out from the background, whether you have low vision or anything like that, that was a really cool way to make it really clear what's happening in the game, because there's no background, just the fighters.
Which also, from like an esports perspective, has another great multi-use, right? So from a presentation, maybe you want the big, rich, high-definition bloom sort of visual effect for someone who's playing single-player story mode of your game, but when they go to some esports competition, maybe the rules are like flat presentation, no background, final destination, no items, blah, blah, blah. You know, like it's a way to take your game and expand it not only to new audiences, but in a way that everyone can enjoy it.
Guy in the back. Yep.
So on the hardware side, one of the issues is that when you're talking about ergonomics and the individual and special needs, everything really, you really need to take the individual into concept, and that's very difficult, which is why we're not seeing mass market as much. Even the Xbox accessibility controller isn't the entire control scheme, it's the brain for the control scheme, which is part of what drives up the expense. But if you're interested or have a need, I would highly encourage people to contact their local makerspace. You're talking about communities of people who like to build stuff, and they're usually just doing it for fun. But when you give them a problem that really improves the quality of life for someone, I have never had an issue where people don't get behind that.
Yeah, so we're talking about one of the challenges of making adaptive devices is the diversity in disabilities. So you have just an incredible range of needs, and how do you adapt to that? And the suggestion is to go to a makerspace in your community and find people who like to build things and make things and collaborate with them. In the front, in the hat.
Okay. It was actually just a comment about motion sickness, and the one suggestion that I saw on YouTube that got really like viral was Tom Cruise and the director of the new Top Gun actually made a YouTube video about newer TVs and how they're actually stunting new like creations coming to, because it's not showing as the creator has made it. So they actually show you how to turn off those features on the TV. So if you YouTube Tom Cruise Top Gun HD TV, they'll actually show you how to turn off those features. And I don't know how to do that either. I get really sad for Smash Brothers.
So this was the second Top Gun reference, which I wasn't really expecting. But yeah, I saw this too, where Tom Cruise and the director of the new Top Gun movie had put out a video showing how to turn off motion smoothing on your TV, which is that thing that adds interpolated frames in between each frame and makes things like really jarring and makes me ill. And it doesn't represent the game the way the creators made it. Same for movies. So there's a cool video where they show you how to turn off motion smoothing on your TV.
I did it for my dad.
Cool. Okay, right here.
Are there any accessibility game jams that you've heard of, seen results of? And I think it would be really good to have some of those, especially in places where it's okay to fail.
No, you're right. These are some ideas. So the question was, are there any accessible game jams, especially ones that aren't competitive? I wrote up some ideas for game jams that can be accessible. I did one where I made a one-button game. And I was surprised. I just kind of made it without accessibility in mind. I didn't even know about accessibility. This was a couple years ago. And I made a game that only had one button. And I put it on the web, and to my surprise, like, people picked it up and were playing it. There was a video of someone playing it with their Xbox adaptive controller, and I had no idea this community existed. I was so excited to discover it. But so I think it'd be really cool if you have a game dev club or whatever at your school or your community that you do an accessible game jam. So you do something like make a game that only uses audio or only uses voice controls or uses a different peripheral like foot pedals. So I made this game and I redid it this semester to be able to be played by anybody. So you can play it with foot pedals, you can play it audio only. It reads out all of the text and how big your fish is that you caught. But also you can play it without needing any audio whatsoever, and it's just a one-button game. So making games like this is great. I've had so much response from the community, especially the blind community. They are really hungry for games that they can understand and play. So I really recommend organizing an accessible game jam in your area.
And you can do this off of larger events. I believe Global Game Jam is at the end of this month, 25th to the 27th, something like that. One of the leads of that actually used to run the game program at American University, Lindsay Grace. He developed a couple really great games. We were talking about different control schemes. He had Huggy Bear, which was a game where he had wired up a large teddy bear. The way you played the game is sort of a free runner, but in order to make the character jump, you had to kind of hug this giant teddy bear and it would jump it along the way. But he's added, there's a sort of a focus on this, and you can use the modifiers that they put in the system to try to meet those guidelines, or you can absolutely just arrange or organize a jam that is focused on accessibility or works under specific conditions in your area. I know there are communities that run game jams writ large. They are competitions, but they don't have to be competitive. You can absolutely take any of these Let 'em Dare, Global Game Jam, any of the other large-scale events, and make it your own. We talked about the community in Makerspace and the like. Same idea, right? If you can foster a community in your area that's kind of focused on a topic or working on it, not only is that going to be like a rewarding thing to work on, I guarantee you that's going to escape that space quickly because there is a hunger for this stuff.
Back there in the gray.
So, I wanted to throw a couple more resources going on with the Makerspace. If you check that, there are some great groups devoted to accessibility and healthcare groups. There's an accessibility fair that I know goes to multiple cities around the country. It's a big event that has a lot of community liaison work going on. If you wanted to talk about game jams or get started there. And also, Mr. Seals, I think, has a few pages throughout the country, and they actually have lending libraries of accessibility tools, and they let anyone check them out, I think, one at a time. If you're interested in some of the switches, pedals,
Awesome.
like some of that stuff.
What was the name of the first event?
It's an accessibility fair.
Accessibility fair.
Accessibility fair? Okay.
Expo, right? Yeah, Accessibility Expo.
Okay.
There's ones, a group that I'm with has been to the one in New York, which is actually like in New Jersey. There's a Boston one, there's one in Chicago, and there's one in Texas. But yeah, it's a great fair, and there's not normally a lot of representation of video games, but it's a huge, I'm a physical therapist, and like my patients need, like, I work with a lot of individuals who have burns, and the emergence of virtual reality has been really, really interesting for my field. And as a gamer who's also in healthcare, I think it's really important to like try to bridge those areas because you see more and more games in like treatment and healthcare. So I think an accessibility expo where they're really focusing a lot on like tools and like medicines and like other like accessible issues that they don't really have that focus on games yet because it's almost like leisure is a privilege, which it really shouldn't be. It should be an everyday thing for everyone.
Thank you for that. I'm used to circulating.
That's very nice.
My question was actually, do you have any suggestions as far as kind of, I know you started to talk about it, spreading the word, talking to people, and what are the two main goals that you think that we should be trying to ask to people who may not know they need accessible gaming or might not know about it?
So the question is, what are the two main ideas we should bring awareness to?
Yeah, suggestions for spreading the word.
How to broadcast better.
Yeah, I think part of it needs to come from the industry, so working with like the Game Developer Association and working with, EA and Blizzard and these big companies, a lot of people, including TJ, who I mentioned in the presentation, he's been doing some consulting, which is great that they're actually listening to people in the disability community. Part of it needs to come from the community and the people, doing talks at GDC and things like that. But on a ground level, I need to think about that.
Having a panel at MAGFest.
Yeah, having a panel at MAGFest doesn't hurt. There's plenty of, I guess, kind of emergent communities where you have a chance to talk about stuff like this. Obviously, the social game changes online every couple of years. Discord is the thing now. We may have a new thing in 10 years called Waffle that everyone uses to communicate. Who knows, right? But there's always sort of ground game opportunities. Maybe it'll be Kenny Loggins on a cloud. By the way, if you make a game jam game with Kenny Loggins on a cloud, we will find you and we will compliment you. There's always going to be ways for us sort of like at the base level to go up and push this stuff and discuss this stuff. Social media is the thing now. It's a good place to start. Websites like yours, I'm just going to thank you for working on that. Those are things that people can look at. They're very clear websites. They give you ideas and delineations, and I have used the IGDA one more than once to go, oh yeah, I forgot I need to do this, and even for like public sector stuff that I've done. So having those resources available and understood and known. How many programmers do we have in the room? Okay, fair number of programmers. I assume if I asked how many of you visit Stack Overflow, I'd get the same number of hands going up. Having something like Stack Overflow for accessibility design is really helpful and really useful. If you know this resource is out there and it's available and you can query it and you can get your answers in 30 seconds and produce what you need to produce and get back on with your day, that's really, really helpful. And that's why we talk a little bit about black boxing these solutions, understanding what they are and having solutions sort of readily available. It's a little tricky in the game space, but we do have engines now, and since we develop games in kind of these standardized patterns and a handful of engines, there's no reason we can't start having some of these solutions prepackaged and ready to go.
And as for like what are the two biggest themes in accessibility in games that we need to make people aware of? I think one of them, and you touched on it, was that leisure should not be a privilege. Everyone should be able to enjoy games as a right. And this is actually, I found this cool quote. It's included in the UN when they did the Day of the Child in like the 70s or 80s, but they said like every child, and everyone at some point is a child, every child should have the right to play. Because play is so meaningful for learning and communicating that everyone should have the right to play. I thought that was really impactful. I was reading a really horrible article by like angrygamer.net or whatever this morning about, he was complaining about how the new FCC guidelines demand that games have, going forward, this just came into effect in January 1, like 5 days ago. All games that have a chat function have to use either text-to-speech or speech-to-text to be more accessible. And they were all like, they completely misinterpreted the article as being that they were going to take their games and make them like too easy or something like that. The FCC was going to take their games from them. And it was just horrible to read all these comments because they just don't understand that all people deserve the right to play games and enjoy something and communicate with other people. And I think we all just need to pile on that person on Twitter.
Do you think they were afraid of just having the stuff they type read out loud somewhere?
Here in the black shirt.
So I'm going to do the thing I actually hate in panels, which is give a comment that I normally at panels. But one resource that is out there that I'm going to self-promote is my nonprofit, Untitled Games. And when people are talking about what to do, is also listen and talk to the people on Twitter that are talking about being disabled and not having resources to game, because a lot of the conversations often leave out the very people that they're affected. Mm-hmm. And I find that with both being a person of color, being visibly disabled, having mental health issues, Because a lot of the conversations, a lot of the questions are really focused on the mechanics and everything else, but accessibility is also financial. Because not everyone can run out and get a PS4, buy the accessible controller, get an Xbox. It's still $300 to $500. So I feel like a lot of the conversations are assuming people have access even to the basics or a computer that they can game on and then just modify it. So I would ask people to think about that as well, not just think of it as in fix the mechanics, fix whatever, but think about the person who can't even afford to buy the controller or anything like that.
Yeah. So that was a comment around how your finances can be a barrier to entry on games because games can be really expensive, especially when you're talking about like VR and buying a $1,000 headset and all this stuff. And for game developers to think about, if your game requires all these special peripherals, how much is that going to cost people?
Yeah, there is no substitute for good subject matter experts, and the best subject matter experts are the people you're trying to design for in the first place.
One of my favorite resources is Reddit/r/disabled gamers, because it's a community of people saying, oh, hey, my husband, he's got multiple sclerosis, what's some games that he can play? Or I'm deaf and I can't play Five Nights at Freddy's because there's no captions, what do I do? So it's a really cool community of people to try and figure out how they're playing games, what types of games they like, and how we can make things better for them. Here in the front, in the blue.
Yeah, so I'm surprised that hasn't come up, even though now I'm thinking about it from what you just said, it's a very cost inefficient game, but have you heard of Moss? You've heard of Moss. So then that's the PSVR game that I don't know too much about the actual gameplay of it, but just that, you're working with a cartoon mouse character, but the way you communicate with them is with sign language. And I haven't even really heard of this game even being talked about in an accessibility fashion. It's more just, this just happens to be the interface. This is just how you happen to communicate with the character. And it's really fascinating because it also exists not just in the space that people who are already using American Sign Language can play a unique game, but also to teach people who don't know how to do American Sign Language, here is a way to do it. And it's not even being posited as an educational game. I just think that's a really interesting thing, and I'm wondering what other things we'll see in that space.
I'm sorry, I have a counter to that.
Yes.
In Moss, you don't actually sign to the character.
Oh, okay.
The character
Signs to you.
signs it as a means of communicating, and it was a demo. I read it about there was a bit of a backlash because it was a demo of an animation demo of the character doing an introduction of himself. But in the game, he's not only just used as much as people were hoping, but there is a lot of gesturing communication.
Sure.
So the dialogue isn't there, but it is pointing, and the way they move is very gesticular.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have a comment about the game Moss, which uses a little cartoon mouse who uses American Sign Language to communicate with you. Really interesting way of communicating in a game that, as far as I know, hasn't been done before. So you can check out Moss. It's cool. I think we are out of time, but I'll be out here in the hallway if you want to chat about accessibility. I just really want to thank you guys for coming. This was great.
Appreciate it.